Logan, this was, without a doubt, the most perfect night I've had in a very long time. But I don't deserve it.
Hey everybody, welcome to the very first real episode of Real Ripe and Real Rotten. This is a podcast where we're going to be taking a look at the highs and lows of your favorite Hollywood artists. Each month we're going to be using Rotten Tomatoes to determine the best and worst film of one individual's filmography. You're going to listen along and you can let us know your thoughts about these movies. So, I am one of your hosts. My name is Wes Teasdale.
And I am your other host, Clay McCormick.
That's right. And you guys might know us from the Star Trek podcast, the Pensky podcast. You might know us from the Prisoner podcast or other shows that we've done. This is a new one. It's called Real Ripe and Real Rotten. And the patrons who support the show at patreon.com/thepenskyfile have chosen Patrick Stewart over William Shatner as our first topic of discussion. So for the first month, we're going to be doing the best and worst film of Patrick Stewart's Rotten Tomatoes filmography list. And that is Logan at 93%, and then we have Christmas Eve at 0%. And this episode is going to be talking about Logan. So, Clay, I thought we'd start this off with just a brief going through the history, the life and times of Sir Patrick Stewart, who was born July 13th, 1940 in Mirfield, England, to Gladys and Alfred Stewart. He has two older brothers, Trevor and Jeffrey, and he grew up poor in a household of domestic violence. His father suffered combat fatigue, which is what they used to call PTSD. I didn't mean to laugh at that, but I just think combat fatigue is a kind of a funny name.
PTSD.
And he was Jesus, I shouldn't be laughing. He's abusive to Stewart's mother. It was sort of a difficult growing up for Patrick Stewart, so he dropped out of school at age 15. Does that surprise you? That he dropped out of school?
Kinda, yeah.
He doesn't seem
he sounds so learned.
Yeah, he doesn't seem the type. Maybe that's just that American cliche of you think British people are intelligent because they talk that way, but I don't know. I guess we'll work through it. But he was 15 when he dropped out. He worked a bunch of odd jobs, including becoming a newspaper reporter. I guess you didn't have a lot of requirements back then when you could just be a high school dropout and become a reporter. He became a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1966 and remained there until 1982. He debuted on TV in 1967 on Coronation Street as a fireman, which is a fantastic role. He had a bunch of roles on British TV and British film, but he never really became a household name. He had minor roles in a bunch of American films of the 80s, including Excalibur, Dune, and Life Force, which we've talked about. We've talked about two of those on our Patreon podcast. So if you want to become a supporter of the show, you can listen to those. In the 1980s, that was his kind of claim to fame. And then in 1987, he auditioned for Star Trek: The Next Generation and won the role of Captain Jean-Luc Picard. The LA Times called him, at his casting, a unknown British Shakespearean actor. The series... he was hoping the series would flop. He had no intention of sticking around, but much to his dismay and much to Star Trek fans' glee, the series went on for 7 years and had 4 feature films. When asked in 2011 for the highlight of his career, he chose Star Trek: The Next Generation because, quote, "it changed everything for me." He commented he would never have joined The Next Generation had he not known that it would air for 7 years. Quote, no. Looking back on it now, it still frightens me a little bit to think that so much of my life was totally devoted to Star Trek and almost nothing else. After Star Trek ended, he went on to do a bunch of sort of movie work. He's done a whole bunch of the X-Men series, which we're going to be talking about. He was 7 X-Men films as Charles Xavier, which is probably one of the most perfect castings of all time, but we'll talk about that. He's done a bunch of TV, voiceover, movies, American Dad, Family Guy, Blunt Talk, Extras, New York and London Theater, the Emoji Movie. He's got a whole bunch of sort of supporting roles at this point. Nothing really breakout outside of the X-Men and Star Trek movies, if you'd even consider those breakouts. But his Rotten Tomatoes, his highest rated movie is LA Story, which he plays the maitre d' in. And then we have Logan at 93%, Star Trek First Contact, and then Clay, what do you think the best rated X-Men movie outside of Logan would be?
If it's not X-Men 2, I'm going to say Days of Futures Past.
Yep, it's Days of Futures Past. And then Green Room is his 5th one. And we're going to be talking...
So wait, how come we're not doing... what was that first one you said?
LA Story.
Maitre d'?
Yeah, because we have to have a couple of rules here where if they're just sort of bit roles, they're not going to be it. He's billed in Logan as the second cast member on the posters and everything.
Yes.
So that's good enough for me to be considered him a movie.
So that means we won't be doing like, if we get to Arnold Schwarzenegger, we won't be doing like Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye as his best movie.
Right. And we won't be doing documentaries or anything like that. And then so just a brief thing about Logan is a 2017 American superhero film produced by Marvel, distributed by Fox. It's the 10th installment in the X-Men film series and the third and final Wolverine solo film after Origins Wolverine and The Wolverine. The film takes its inspiration from Old Man Logan comic book series by Mark Millar and Steve McNiven. It follows an aged Wolverine and an extremely ill Professor X defending the former's biological Mexican daughter Laura from the villainous Reavers in the Alkali Transigen, led by Xander Rice and Donald Pierce. Directed by James Mangold, he wrote the screenplay with Scott Frank and Michael Green. Hugh Jackman stars as Logan in his allegedly final portrayal of the character after having played the role for 17 years, with Patrick Stewart, the focus of this podcast, co-starring as Charles Xavier. It's at 93% on Rotten Tomatoes from the critics, 90% on the audience score, which people were concerned about. Clay, do you look at the audience ratings for Rotten Tomatoes as opposed to the critic ratings?
Not really. I'll be honest with you. I don't use Rotten Tomatoes that much at all. Excuse me. Yeah, I guess I kind of, when I do, I kind of look at both of them because, you know, it's kind of like looking at reviews on Amazon to an extent, where you kind of have to get an aggregate of like a handful of them to kind of parse out what the actual issue is.
Yeah, you need to know what the motivation of writing the review is.
Yeah, but at the same time, you know, you got to watch. Like it's like if you're looking at something on Amazon and you see that there's like a bunch of low ratings, and you look at those low ratings, and all of those low ratings are, I'm giving this a 1 because Amazon did not give me the right box.
Right.
You know, like it has nothing to do with the actual product. It has like, it's like some service thing that really doesn't help anybody if you rate it that low.
The Rotten Tomatoes critic consensus for Logan is Hugh Jackman makes the most of his final outing as Wolverine with a gritty, nuanced performance in a violent but surprisingly thoughtful superhero action film that defies genre conventions. So, Clay, I thought that the best way to get into this would be, my question to you is, how would you describe Patrick Stewart's film actor role? Like, you know how there's categories of actors. There's leading man, there's character actor, there is, you know, things like that. I was trying to figure out, he has a pretty interesting filmography, really, where he's never really the leading man of anything. But at the same time, I wouldn't call him a character actor. He's almost like a second tier star in a weird way. And I don't know if that's insulting to him, but it's just funny because he can obviously star on TV and theater as the lead name, but he doesn't make that into movies in the same way.
Yeah, he seems to be perpetually the with category, you know, where they go through the people who are in the movie and then it'll say with Patrick Stewart or you know, with somebody and Patrick Stewart, that kind of thing. Like it's the elder statesman role. Because I can't think of a movie he's starred in, right? Like he's
Christmas Eve, which is at 0%.
Wait, he has a starring role in that movie?
He's the lead role. It looks like it's an ensemble movie. I haven't seen it yet, but he's the number one name on the credits and the poster. Yeah.
It should be interesting.
Yep.
But yeah, he is he does fulfill a weird role because he's not really a leading man, but he's not a utility player. He's just like a really solid secondary star. Yeah, like you were saying.
Yeah, it's unique. I'm sure there are other people that are like that, but it's funny to me that he's proven that he can do it. It might just be a byproduct of his age at the time he started making movies. Like he wasn't in the 80s when he was younger, he wasn't name enough to actually star in things. So he was a guest, not a guest actor, but he was a secondary or third tertiary star on things like Dune and things like that. And as he got older, he's a little bit too old to be the leading man role, but he just kind of slides into these secondary roles, the with Patrick Stewart and all that stuff. And he does a good job in it. And that ties us into he did the 4 Star Trek films, and that slides into his, probably after the Star Trek films, the X-Men series is his biggest film role for how long it's been and how many movies. He's done 7 movies, 17 years basically. And I think that I'll start off the conversation by just saying that you can feedback off of me or give me feedback on what I'm about to say. But the X-Men superhero movies are probably my favorite of the superhero movie series that are out there. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I think that they're the best ones. I think that they make the best movies out of all of them. Not that a lot of them are perfect. And it's funny to me, the X-Men series, more than any of the other superhero series, has undergone a huge transformation from like where it started with X-Men and X-Men 2. If you go back and watch X-Men, the original movie, it looks like the budget was like $100,000 at this point. Like it's so cheap looking. And now they're really sort of Days of Future Past, like looks fantastic. And now the cast is just enormous and there's all these things going. And then you have these really great movies like Logan, and I like Days of Future Past. And then you have really terrible movies like Age of Apocalypse or whatever, the X-Men Apocalypse. And so the variety that the X-Men movies have is different from all the other superhero movies. And I think that Logan ties into that in a lot of ways.
I don't know how you got me here, but thank you.
De nada.
Yeah. You can talk? You can talk? Fuck. Why the fuck? What's all this bullshit been for the last 2,000 fucking miles?
Sobre nada que hable contigo si me insultas, si me gritas,
What?
si me intentas dejar
Okay, shut the fuck up!
Yeah. You know, the X-Men are unique among superhero franchises because they've kind of existed before the boom, and they haven't, and it's been essentially the same cast for more or less for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
So you can see in that first movie where they still were kind of, Hollywood was still like embarrassed about comic books a little bit. Like there's a lot of comic book stuff in the first X-Men movie. But at the same time, everybody's wearing black leather. And they're kind of playing a lot of the flashier stuff down, although Toad is still there and looks fucking weird for some reason.
The jumping is all done by wire work, it looks like, at that point still,
Yeah, they weren't doing a lot of, CGI body replacements and stuff like that, at least not to the extent that they do now. And, yeah, like you were saying, you fast forward to Days of Future Past, which is just, so like the first X-Men movie, you don't really okay, let me backtrack one more time. The thing that I love about Days of Future Past is when I was watching it, I realized it was the first time out of all of these movies where you got to see the X-Men fighting together, just doing X-Men stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And if you go back to the first one, you don't really get that. They just kind of like walk around, and then like one person fights one person, and then one person fights another person, kind of like any other action movie ensemble usually goes, where it's like, oh, they tackled Wolverine off screen, so they're going to fight for 5 minutes.
Yes, the fight scenes are like their own little set pieces of characters whose powers kind of interact with each other, interestingly, or maybe not so interesting, but they have like Sabretooth versus Logan, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and then you've got a nice fight scene with Wolverine and Mystique, which has a little bit of CGI, special effects stuff, but it's mostly just a fist fight. But then in Days of Future Past, the movie opens with 5 X-Men all on screen together, all using their powers to fight fucking Sentinels. And it's like, when you get to that point, as a comic book fan, I was just freaking out, because that's the thing that I've been waiting to see in these movies. For as much as I love them, X-Men 2 I think is still probably the best one top to bottom, just because the story is so good. But even that one doesn't have a ton of X-Men stuff in it. Like you go back, I remember watching X-Men 2 and losing my shit when Colossus showed up for half a second.
Yeah,
just because they hadn't really done that stuff, and speculating about what background characters are supposed to be which mutants. And then Days of Future Past comes along, and it's like, no, this is clearly fucking Bishop from the comic. I never thought in a million years I'd see Bishop in a movie.
Sure.
But so I know we're not talking about Logan, but this leads into Logan for me anyway. Yes,
it does. Yep.
Because Logan is, and I give them all the credit in the world for taken 3 times to get it right. But Logan is the Wolverine movie that hits that freak out level that Days of Futures Past hit for me with the X-Men in general. Logan hits that for Wolverine, because Wolverine in these movies has always been kind of, he's been kind of cool. The first movie doesn't really do a lot. The second movie, he has one scene where he kind of, messes a bunch of guys up, which is awesome. And at the time I freaked out about that, but you never really got to see Wolverine.
You know what's,
and in this movie, what's that?
Well, you know what's funny about the X-Men 2 scene? There is no blood in the fight scene. Where he goes around stabbing people in the chest with his claws and stuff like that. What's funny to me is the way that they set Wolverine up. It makes sense in sort of a business standpoint, where Wolverine is in the first movie, right? So if they had hindsight and they kind of set this up as a Marvel Cinematic Universe, I feel that Wolverine is the kind of character you introduce in the second movie. After the team has been formed, you bring in this sort of renegade character who doesn't want to be on the team. He's obviously too popular at the time to exclude him from the first movie, but on a story level, he feels like he should come in later and not really fit in with the group dynamic that's been set up. And they can't do that at that point. So my main problem with the X-Men movies is that going all the way from the original movie to Logan, this includes a criticism of Logan, is that for every movie involves Wolverine learning to work with other people. He never seems to remember that working with other people is a good thing to do. So he always has to reset his character back to the character who doesn't give a fuck about anybody. And then he's like, oh, never mind, I actually do care. And then 2 years later, another movie comes out and he's back to the same story arc. And that's kind of a problem with Logan at this point. It's just that character arc is so repetitive across all the X-Men movies.
Yeah, I feel like they actually break that with him in Days of Futures Past, because he pretty much is good to go from the beginning of that movie. But yeah, I think what that comes down to though is Wolverine as just a part of the team is a little bit boring. He's the thing that made him so attractive was that he was this outsider character that was kind of a loose cannon. So if his character going forward is just no, he's just, he teaches at the school, it kind of, they've been doing that for a long time in the comics, I guess, and I'm sure they've been doing it successfully. I haven't been reading a lot of them recently, but I don't know. I seem like that takes a little bit of edge away from him,
Yeah, and I think it ties into the fact that there's no blood in X2 during his thing is problematic from the sense of the blood is what separates that character from the rest of the X-Men. His sort of
100%.
His brutality level is what makes it different. And I give the second movie credit for he's actually killing these guys with his claws, but they don't approach Logan-esque territory where the violence of this character is fundamental to the movie, how violent everything is.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the X-Men movies ever really make a point of it, but it seems like it's a natural conflict for this well-organized pacifist group of mutants to be totally off-put by Logan's personality type, basically.
Yeah. And they never explored what his violence means to that group either. Because, like you're saying, the X-Men fight, it's almost like the X-Men fighting other mutants is kind of like sparring to a certain extent.
Yes.
No one really gets hurt. And, Cyclops can blast shit, but no one, he doesn't cut people in two or anything like that. And then you've got Wolverine, who's just... he's just fucking killing people.
Right.
It's like if you're playing pickup basketball and then that one guy comes to play and he just the first play he gets the ball and elbows somebody in the nose.
Yeah.
It's like that shock of playing style.
Logan is playing by Jordan rules, to use the basketball analogy. He is hitting hard anytime someone comes into the lane.
Yeah, and they never really got into what that means in the context of the team. Which, when they eventually bring him back in some form, I would love to see if they did that, where they really, because up through the first handful of movies, he's an outsider because he's a loner.
Yeah.
He's not an outsider because he's a loner who is also an assassin who just fucking wrecks people.
Right. I think that it's kind of a funny stance on Xavier's pacifist route, which is that he has this team. The movies do this more than the comics, I think, but the movies have this thing where, everything's well and good with the X-Men team. However, when you need someone to come in and actually save the day, Logan fits that role because he's the one that can come in and actually, cause violence onto people, as opposed to the other members of the team who are more reticent to do that. Or if they are, their powers are used to knock people over as opposed to actually cause harm to them.
Exactly.
And so Logan is for all of the sort of peace and stuff that Xavier represents and wanting to get to the best of mankind, he kind of has to use this wrecking ball to do it in a lot of ways, or at least defend himself from more aggressive people.
Yeah, and I know in the comics, one of the more recent iterations of X-Force, they turned X-Force into basically the Black Ops Wetworks team for the X-Men. And if I remember correctly, in the book itself, or in the X-Men comics universe, there was a big debate about whether or not that was a good thing to do. I think Cyclops was running the team at the time, and he, told Wolverine to put this team together, and there was a lot of pushback from other people being like, well, don't you think you're going to a place we don't need to go to? And that's sort of interesting, ethics argument, really, about whether or not you should take the gloves off.
Right.
And I find that interesting. I'm not upset, but I'm bummed out that they never really had the time to deal with that a little bit, because up until this movie, Wolverine is kind of he's kind of a cartoon Wolverine to a certain extent, where he's got all it's like, do you remember the second Ninja Turtles movie, Secret of the Ooze?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
The thing that always weirded me out about that movie is that they wouldn't let Leonardo fight with his swords. because in those movies, they're all, they're for kids, and they're all about violence, but not to the point where anyone actually really gets hurt. And one of your main characters is fighting with two fucking swords.
Right, yeah.
So he had to ditch his swords and fight with sticks, and it always felt weird to me. And I feel like most of the X-Men movies up to this point are very similar, where it's they've got the protective cork tips on the end of Wolverine's claws.
Yes, yeah. And the movies are more content to focus on previous to Logan. They're almost more content to focus on the pain that Wolverine suffers from them. It's more of an internal pain that he's going through with them, as opposed to the fact that they are incredibly dangerous to other people who sort of get on his bad side and things like that.
Which is interesting, because there's an aspect that they didn't do in this movie that I was actually looking it up to see if I just made this up or not, and the my results are inconclusive. I'm gonna have to look up some more stuff. But so I mean, this movie is all about Wolverine kind of dealing with his history, right? We can get into the clone thing a little bit later, but he's literally fighting himself. The villain of this movie is Wolverine.
Yes.
As far as Wolverine is concerned. And there's an aspect that they didn't do, again, which I may have made this up when I was a kid, I can't remember. But in the comics, my understanding of the group, the Reavers, who are the
cyborgs,
the cyborg mercenaries that hunt down the X-23 in this movie. My understanding of the Reavers was during the Dark Phoenix saga, there's this awesome sequence where Wolverine gets knocked into the sewer of the Hellfire Club.
Yep.
And then the rest of the X-Men team is incapacitated, and they assume Wolverine is as well, but of course he's not. And he makes his way up through the Hellfire Club's base, just fucking wrecking people. And he goes through and he basically kills everybody.
Sure.
And, or killing and maiming. And I was under the impression, I thought I read this somewhere. I may have made it up. If I made it up, it's pretty good. And I give a pat on the back to young Clay for this. I was under the impression that the Reavers in the comic were members of that Hellfire Club group that Wolverine had maimed, who had then become cyborgs and specifically were going after Wolverine. So they were literal consequences of Wolverine's actions coming back to haunt him.
Right.
And I kind of wish, I wish they had used that in the movie, assuming that's a real thing that happened again. I don't know. But I thought, like, thematically, that would have been so perfect to fit into this movie if all of these guys, all of these mercenaries were basically victims of Wolverine through the years who had, now come back more powerful. And all. Thematically, I thought that would have been a great addition. I don't know if that's too complicated, because I think what this movie does really well, and what I've noticed the last few movies we watched, is it's a really simple concept and it's just done really well.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a key, and I think a good springboard into talking about this one. So I think that it's a very simple story that, again, maybe you could consider repetitive in terms of the Wolverine story, where it's Logan looking for sort of a redemption arc going forward to rescue this little girl and bring her to Eden, which is somewhere in North Dakota, apparently.
Sorry, I just want to say he's not... The thing that's really I've always found interesting about Wolverine is he's not ever looking for redemption. He's always actively trying to avoid it.
Yes, yeah.
But he can't not do the right thing. He sets himself up as this badass who's going to just, like, if it doesn't involve me, I don't want any part of it. But he always ends up doing the right thing, even if it ends up getting him killed.
Yeah, right. Yeah, quite literally here. I mean, so I think a good point here is to reset and start from the beginning how we normally do, just because I'm sort of comfortable with that format. Yep. So this is the first time I've ever seen Logan.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I had not watched it before this. To give backstory of my previous X-Men things, I like Days of Future Past and First Class, I think, are the two best X-Men movies. Mm-hmm. The worst ones are like Apocalypse and whatever the terrible first Wolverine solo story is, where he's fighting Deadpool on the top of the nuclear reactor. Yeah,
woof.
So that's my sort of going into, that's my sort of stance on the X-Men movies in general. I thought that this one is a good way for the movie series to go, which is a smaller story, sort of low key. It's not really even kind of a superhero story. Like it's the exact opposite of every reason that I hated the Apocalypse movie, because the Apocalypse movie was just the boilerplate. This is how you make a superhero movie at this point.
You mean you don't like people standing in the middle of swirling particles for 2 hours?
As every city on Earth is destroyed by forces that we can't comprehend yet. You never see anybody die. Although exactly. I will say that the best part of Apocalypse was the thing you pointed out, where at the end they fight Apocalypse in a very comic booky way, where they're all doing something different.
Yes.
Which is kind of nice. But outside of that, the movie was not good.
I think the best part of Apocalypse is when Apocalypse gathers all of his horsemen and they're like listening to Metallica in a factory and he's giving them all makeovers.
Well, yeah, it brings up. We'll have to do Apocalypse at some point. Apocalypse is just an impossible villain to do. That's the reason that the Logan movie works well. And I'll kick this off to you by just saying that the reason I really like the X-Men movies and why I think they're very good superhero movies, if they're not the best, they're the ones that I kind of enjoy the most, is because they're the only series to me, and this goes across the Marvel universe, it goes across the Batman stuff, it goes across the DCU universe, it goes across all this stuff, where the X-Men movies are the only ones where I actually feel an emotional reaction to the fact that the heroes, in certain points, the heroes always feel like they could lose what's going on. The X-Men are never overpowered or cartoonishly confident like the Avengers would be. Like, it's never this sort of like, all we have to do is act on it. The X-Men movies do a very good job of putting people in bad situations that you feel that they actually are in trouble at a certain point and things could go bad for them. And I think Logan really does that well.
Yeah, no, I agree. The thing with the X-Men movies that usually works pretty well is that a lot of times you end up with characters who, I mean, most of the time it's characters who have these powers that can that are the solution to the situation they're in, but they are not confident enough in the use of them to know whether or not they can pull it off.
Yeah.
And that's really easy to relate to. I mean, aside from, I'm not saying that I know what it's like to be able to, lift a stadium with my mind, but I do know what it's like to have a task in front of me that I don't know if I can do it.
Yeah.
On that level.
Oh, go ahead.
On that level, I think they're really easy to relate to. And I mean, the entire concept, the difference with the X-Men, between the X-Men and like the Avengers is, the Avengers are cool. Like nobody on the Avengers is, they play it up as the movies have gone on. Like, Ant-Man is kind of a weirdo and Spider-Man's kind of a dorky kid. But like the Avengers are like pretty confident and pretty cool dudes who all can do really awesome stuff. And the X-Men are all outcasts. And I think that's why their people are attracted to them.
Yeah.
Because it's a really easy thing to identify with. Go ahead.
Well, I think that it ties into like the point you made before about like they're maybe not confident in using their powers. It also just ties into the fact that a lot of them have powers that are not particularly useful in any sort of way. Like and I think that Caliban fits into that here, where his power is really only a downside to him the entire time.
Yeah.
Like he has no fighting ability, he has no anything like that. His ability is only that he can track other mutants, and that makes him the perfect mutant for them to sort of torture into the government helping using him that way.
Yeah.
And so, I that's always Wolverine is well equipped, and X-23 is well equipped in this one. And they bring in, Patrick Stewart's role as Xavier, who's going through this sort of disease state as he approaches the end of his life, is the other sort of weakness opportunity here. But I think that Logan's an interesting movie because it does all those things that I think that the X-Men series do well. It has the weakness. It has sort of the characters being the sympathy you feel for the mutants as the government or whatever agency is using them is very realistic. Mm-hmm. I do feel that it's not a perfect movie, largely because I think that the Caliban character is so clearly a writing excuse that he kind of distracts me from things.
My name is Dr. Rice. But you can call me Xander if you like. My colleague tells me you've been somewhat resistant. He believes you've been dispensing delayed information to allow your friends to stay one step ahead. I'm offering you the possibility of redemption, Caliban. To protect the world and in the process, save your friends. The girl is a rather small price to pay for that. Unlike you, she isn't pure. She wasn't made by nature. She's a mistake of my own.
I did what I could, and they burnt me and beat me. Your colleagues are savages.
I agree. The Reavers were very ineffective, but I'm bringing new tools to bear. I still need someone to point us in the right direction.
No, I can't help you.
Breathe. But what does he have, the old man? Alzheimer's, ALS, a degenerative brain disease in the world's most dangerous brain. What a combo.
Caliban is only there, and he only has that power because they need a way for the government to find them at some level. Like,
right.
His power does not. There's no reason why Wolverine would have chosen Caliban to be the person who looks after Professor X. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's nothing that he does that's specifically useful to Wolverine.
Right, and he can only. They have a sort of awkward interaction where once the government finds that their base in Mexico, he says, I thought you said you could track them. And he says, you know my power, I can only track mutants. So there's not even like, you can't even use Caliban as like an alarm system to tell you that people are coming, because he can only sense mutants, and mutants are the least of their worries at that point.
Yeah, and this, you have no idea what their relationship is, or, they don't ever go into like them being buddies or anything.
Right, and then even his, you feel bad for him. He's tortured and everything to sort of help the government find him. And then his death is actually not even useful in any way. He doesn't do anything. He kills himself, but he doesn't kill the main bad guy. And they actually use his dead body at the very end to
well, I guess he kind of creates a diversion so they can get out of there.
Does he? Because I thought the fight with the fake Wolverine continued after that point. I can't remember though. You might be right.
Yeah, I think the fight itself might be done, but I think his death causes enough of a distraction that
They can drive off.
They can drive off. Yeah, I think. Okay. I can't exactly remember, but maybe I'm just giving him too much credit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll fire it back by just saying that people have described it as a Western and a film noir, and I think it's neither. And I actually think that's why it's kind of an interesting movie. I think this movie doesn't have a genre, really. It has bits and pieces of a lot of different things, but it's kind of a unique mashup of different stuff.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I saw an interview with the director, and they were asking him kind of a question like that, and he said he thinks it's very much a Western, or that's where he was drawing a lot of inspiration from. And I mean, the emotional core of the movie is pretty literally described by the Professor X watching Shane.
Yes, right.
Which is a famous Western. So that's definitely in there. But yeah, there's I could see some noir stuff in there. I can see samurai like it feels a lot like Lone Wolf and Cub. A little bit. There's a lot of stuff going on, and yeah, it is a really interesting mix because I feel like since the 90s, specifically since Quentin Tarantino came around, not that he really does this, but people who came after him started doing this. There were a lot of like genre mashup kind of things that were very, very clear what the mixes were. And so you'd be like, oh, well, this is a samurai movie, but it takes place in Chicago during Prohibition or something like that.
Yeah.
And I feel like that trend has continued for about 20 years. And this kind of bucks it by not really, I mean, it has all those influences, but you can't really pin it down to one of them. And it does make for a better movie and something more interesting and kind of different.
Yeah. Yeah. And it still feels like an X-Men movie at the same time. Like
it does what you're supposed to do, which is not have your influences and then brag to everybody what your influences are. It has its influences and then it synthesizes those together to make something new.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Not that this is like reinventing the wheel or anything, but it's good.
Yeah. I mean, my general take on this is that as someone who's kind of worn out by superhero movies, this one feels refreshingly not like a superhero movie in a lot of ways. It's really just kind of it's not an adventure story, but it's kind of a redemption story just told, on sort of almost like a road trip adventure kind of thing that they're going on. And it almost, I like the fact that it takes liberties with stuff. Like, would you consider this movie to be like an official story in the main X-Men universe line?
I want to say no, if only because it takes, like, the biggest downer about this movie. This movie's very dark.
Yes, it's very sad.
This might be one of the darkest movies. Definitely the darkest comic book movie I've ever seen. But it's just one of the darkest movies in general I've seen in a while. There's an implication that they don't really go into, but they give you enough for you to infer that basically Professor X had an aneurysm or a seizure and killed the X-Men.
Yeah, at least 7 of them. Yeah,
at least a few of them. Yeah, and it's the bummer about this movie is that Days of Future Past, and the director specifically said he picked the time that it takes place in, so it wouldn't interfere with any continuity. Which I don't give a shit, but
because it takes place earlier than the Future Past stuff.
No, it takes place after.
After the Sentinel era. This takes place after that.
I believe it takes place after the future era. So,
okay,
yeah, which is what makes it so sad because the ending of Days of Future Past is so positive. Like Wolverine literally wakes up in the future and everything bad that has happened to him is just gone.
Yeah, that's right.
So, Cyclops isn't dead. Professor X isn't dead. Jean Grey isn't dead. All these other things that have been negative aspects of the whole series are gone, and it's just like, you're a teacher at the school, and everybody's here, and everybody's fine. Fast forward a couple years later, and everyone's dead.
Yeah, I mean,
it's your fault.
What's It is a tremendously sad movie, and I could maybe see the argument that people wouldn't particularly like it, because what Logan does is essentially argues that everything that the X-Men have been doing up to this point has either not amounted to anything or actively caused harm to people. And they both, Xavier and Logan, die by the end of this movie, and they're, I like the realism of it. It's weird to me what it does to the X-Men storyline if you consider all of the films to be one universe, which I think they do a good enough job of confusing you where that doesn't seem obvious, and it's not really a question that you bring up. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things I actually like is they keep everything in this movie as far as Wolverine continuity goes through the 3 movies. They just strip away the shitty stuff and keep just enough to make it interesting. Like they keep he's got his samurai sword that he got from the second Wolverine movie, but he also has the adamantium bullets from the first shitty Wolverine movie, which play a very large role in this movie.
Yes. Yeah.
So I always appreciate when you can keep the shitty stuff as part of the story, but use it in a way where it kind of redeems it a little bit.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that they do a good job of weaving that all in together. So, I mean, the story ends up feeling like it belongs in the universe, but you could also tell me that this is sort of a side universe at the same time, where it's just an artistic interpretation of what could happen at the end of their lives. Yeah. And I think it really works well that way. It works well it's a nice commentary on social change too, I think, in some point where, the X-Men you could argue that the X-Men are fighting for basically equal rights constantly in all their movies. They're basically the outcasts of society, or the minorities who are demanding to be taken, not be treated poorly. Mm-hmm. And it's a nice metaphor for the slowness of social change, which is kind of sad at the same time. Like, during your lifetime, you're unlikely to see a lot of change if you're a persecuted minority. Like, it's kind of a sad thing. Like, things could improve and get better for you, but it's the next generation's responsibility to sort of do things with it. You can only do so much in your time that you're on this planet. And the movie kind of mirrors that, where Xavier and Logan are trying to do their change that they can, but they literally pass it off to kids at the end of the movie. And it's like, now this is with you going forward.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Do you think killing Wolverine, spoiler alert, is the right move at the end of this? Because
I think the ending of the movie is actually the weakest part of it in a lot of ways. Like, from everything from the fight scene to the actual resolution of what's going on.
Yeah, because it didn't really occur to me as I was watching it, because I think I was so depressed by what was happening. But I watched a review of it later, and the person reviewing it had a good point, which was, it feels like the end of this movie should be Wolverine leading the kids into Canada, because the whole movie is him running from this responsibility, or trying to reject this responsibility, or reject his role as one of the X-Men, or his role in the story, basically
as a caretaker, essentially.
Yeah,
he's a conflicted caretaker the entire movie.
Yeah, and Xavier's gone, so there's nobody else to really do it, and these kids are on their own. It feels like the thematic, satisfying ending should be Wolverine survives. He's probably still pretty fucked up, but he survives and is now the person to lead the next generation on. Right.
Yeah. 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 I don't disagree. I think that I guess it all ties into how well you think that they're selling and utilizing the fact that, did they ever clarify why Wolverine's powers are kind of fading away?
I think the implication is adamantium poisoning.
Oh, okay. That makes sense, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, the fact is that he's sort of aging and his powers are losing their effectiveness and everything throughout the entire movie. And he's mirroring Xavier's sort of downturn in that way. I think that the sort of thematically of what they're trying to do with the characters fading away like that and Wolverine dying at the end and Xavier, I actually think it's kind of a problem in how they portray it. I think they do the Logan aspect better, where he doesn't heal quite as quickly. Like he's starting to scar. Like he retains injuries from previous things. He walks with a limp throughout most of the movie.
His claw arthritis might be my favorite thing ever.
What do you mean? How like slowly the claws come out at this point?
Yeah, how he can't like one claw. He has to like pull it out all the way. Like it can't. He has something in there is like catching. It's great.
It's jammed up. And I think that to bring this back to Patrick Stewart, the point of the podcast is maybe not to talk about the roles individually, but to just sort of be a springboard into it. I actually feel that Patrick Stewart, his performance in this movie is excellent. I think that Xavier is not written perfectly from a previous, this is what Patrick Stewart as Xavier was, like from a sense of the character being as existing in these previous movies, to just the writing of the way that Xavier talks in this movie, to what the nature of his disease is I think all of those things are kind of weak links in an otherwise pretty sterling performance from him. Yeah. Maybe the best Xavier performance that we've seen so far. And I think that the biggest problem to me is the nature of Xavier's illness. The fact that as long as he's taking medication, he's okay is problematic to me on a story level, where I feel that his disease should be more like Alzheimer's to me, where here's my problem with the Xavier thing. Xavier, if he's the character that I know from the previous movies, who's this sort of stand-up man who is like always wants to protect, for the greater good, he wants to protect people, I don't see a reason why in this movie he never considers suicide. And
I see, yeah.
And I think that if he was riddled by Alzheimer's and was unable to do that, Wolverine would not be able to kill him, even though that should be the best thing in everyone's interest to do, because he's not of the right mind. Where they have this thing where Xavier seems to be 100% in control as long as he's on his medication, and he seems unwilling to remove himself from this dangerous situation for whatever reason.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think Xavier, the character that I know, would do that. He would remove himself from the situation. That bothered me a little bit too on a different level. The scene where they have dinner at the family's house.
Yeah.
The fact that Xavier is like, no, we should stay here for the night, really bothered me this time around, because I was thinking to myself, how does he's got to know that he's putting this family directly in harm's way by doing that.
Wolverine brings it up to him. He mentions it to him. He's like, this is maybe not the best idea to stay here. People are chasing us.
Yeah. That bothered me a little bit, because I feel like that's kind of in line with what you're saying, is that's not something that he would actively do.
Right.
Like, I don't see why they couldn't still do that scene by having them offer for them to stay, and then they'd be like, no, we can't, we gotta keep moving. And then something happens to him physically where it's like they kind of have to stay. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Like some sort of thing like that. Maybe that's not, I don't know. Maybe that's, I think that would work.
Yeah. You could tie it into his, if it is something like Alzheimer's, it's the family insists that he has to stay, because you have this sort of guy who's clearly should not be traveling at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, you could still have those scenes where he's like, oh, this is the best night I've had.
And that's the whole reason he has to stay there, just to... My problem with some of the script is that we mentioned in the Discovery podcast is very occasionally this script feels like the writing is just being done because they need to get to that point. I feel most strongly with Caliban, who I feel just exists because he needs to exist here. Mm-hmm. And the Xavier thing where he wants to stay at the family just because he wants one night of sort of feeling normal and not sad about everything that's happened. Which then ends in the saddest thing where a person who looks exactly like Wolverine comes in and stabs him, and then the real Logan runs in and says to a dying Xavier, I didn't do it wasn't me, which is probably the saddest thing. At least they didn't really have a brouhaha fight before that. Like, that's the way I would consider a more cliched script to go, where they were fighting and then he died and he never had a chance to apologize to him. They don't do that.
I also really like that Xavier doesn't have some like long-winded final monologue as he's bleeding out. Like, he just kind of dies.
He fades away. Yeah, he just fades away. Yeah.
Which is kind of refreshing in a morbid sort of way.
Yeah, right.
And it's going back a little bit to your question about does this feel like it takes place in the X-Men universe as it stands? I feel like the answer is kind of yes and no, because it's using elements from the other stuff, but it's like this is a Wolverine movie. Right. This isn't an X-Men movie, and there's nothing that says you can't tell a story native to Wolverine using those pieces that maybe doesn't have larger, reaching implications to the series. And and what I like about it is part of the X-Men thing is being afraid of losing control. Most of your main characters, your Cyclopses, Jean Grey, Wolverine, even Professor X, their whole thing is really repression. I guess Wolverine less so, but even as far as Wolverine goes, he's still repressed to a certain extent. Yeah. Wolverine is afraid, in the comics anyway, he's afraid of losing control and going berserk and killing everybody.
Yeah,
Xavier's
they kind of bring it up here with his they bring it up here with his once he takes that medication, the green serum, his sort of rage becomes more prominent. Yeah.
And, Xavier's always afraid of losing control and doing something on a massive scale with his brain. Cyclops needs to wear his visor and glasses, otherwise he loses control and blows everything up. Jean Grey, if Jean Grey loses control, she turns into a space god and kills everybody. And I think this movie is a good extension of that, where it's exploring what happens if they do lose control. Like, Professor X is not in control in this movie, and you can see he's killed the entire X-Men team. Yeah. And when he's off of his pills, he has those weird seizures that cause harm. Wolverine's not in control. He's in control of some things, but he's not really in control of his body.
Yep.
And it's kind of to the point where he has to literally fight himself. He's looking at a version of himself that he cannot control at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And he can't match up to. He is inferior to the younger version of him, basically.
Yeah, and so I think some of that stuff with Xavier, I think works because it's sort of dealing with that aspect where it's like there are some things he can control and some things he can't, and I think that's part of what's nice about that scene where they do stay is like for a second they get to kind of take a breath. But I would agree. I would agree that it's not probably as tightly executed as it could be.
Yeah. Yes. And the losing control thing for Xavier and everything like that it does well for the service of the Logan character and the relationship that he has with Xavier at that point, where he's the one X-Men who doesn't. He might be the only one left alive as far as we know, but he's the one that doesn't abandon him at the very end. It's obviously they fake being grandfather, son, and daughter at a point in the movie when they're all traveling together, the relationship actually is that. On some level, like they're not biologically related, but that is their relationship to each other. And the fact that they mimic it is a nice sort of callback and sort of awareness of that's the situation with these characters going forward.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see here. I don't know. I guess we can just we've been talking for an hour, so I guess we can kind of give a sort of light wrap up of the movie and everything that we thought, but I think it's
before we do that, I want to get into one aspect that we can talk about a little bit.
Sure.
How do you feel about the clone, the Logan clone? Do you think that's too on the nose, or do you think it works?
I didn't think it was too on the nose. I actually just didn't kind of like it on like a story level for some reason. Like maybe it is because it's too on the nose and he's fighting his younger self, but it didn't really. It felt unrealistic to me in a way that the rest of the movie didn't on some level. It felt like it was too much of an X-Men sci-fi moment at that point. Yeah. And it took me out of the movie a little bit. But I'm also a little bit hazy on the entire villain plot that's going on. I don't think it really matters because it's not really the story that I'm interested here, but there's a lot of stuff going on that I don't really care to know about. I don't know why they introduced, what's the guy's name? Xander Rice? Is he the scientist?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what the point of him being there. I thought it was funny how they kill him off at the end, which is just kind of random and it just happens. But
Yeah, I really like that.
his whole reason to be in the movie didn't make a lot of sense to me. Even the sledgehammer away, like he's like, you know who I am? He's like, yeah, I killed your father when I escaped. He's like, yes, you did, and this is the reason why everything has happened to all the mutants, because of my vengeance thing. The villains didn't strike me as particularly great in this movie, outside of just being a force that's constantly chasing them.
Yeah, I think they work thematically. Like, I think, whereas the issue, kind of expounding on the control theme, the villains are all about control and like a negative control, because they have control over mutants. They have control literally over Wolverine, whereas Wolverine has lost control of even his DNA. And these guys have it. And I think it works. I think it makes the villain, the clone, work for me. Because usually I hate that shit. I don't know. Usually that stuff feels really hacky. But I feel like it works here because I don't think anybody else in that position would have made thematic or sense or been satisfying. Like, I know that there was some talk of that character actually being Sabretooth.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that. I was like, well, Sabretooth, I mean, I guess, it'd be kind of cool to see Sabretooth again, but like to introduce him that late into the movie doesn't really have any like thematic weight to it. Any other villain I could.
Well, the Sabretooth thing, I would vastly, like, they'd have to do something where, like, would it be the real Sabretooth? It wouldn't be a clone of Sabretooth? That would be the way.
I think so, yeah.
So, I mean, the cloning angle reveals the fact that, like, that provides the drive for why the clones do what they do. They've been programmed, basically. If it was Sabretooth, I'd have a problem being like, why is he doing this, kind of, at this point? And I don't think the movie is really the one that... This is not the movie where they want to explain Sabretooth's sort of rationale for what he's doing. Yeah.
Yeah. As I was thinking about it, I was like, this is the only... If you're going to have him have another mutant that he has to fist fight, I think this is the only one that makes sense.
Yes.
Is for it to be another version of him. Because it is on the nose, but I think it works. And
what if it was another clone that didn't look... that was not Hugh Jackman? Would that have been better, or would you been like that's
you mean like a mouthless Deadpool from the first X-Men? Because I was thinking about that as I was watching it this time. I was like, this works for me. If it was something else, and as soon as I thought that, I was like, oh, you mean like the first X-Men movie where they do essentially the same kind of thing, where the Weapon X program is taking DNA to create a super weapon, and it turns into this fucking abortion of a Deadpool,
right?
And it's just stupid. And like, that's why you end up when you do that stuff, that's why you end up having to couch it in scenes where you've got Wolverine, Sabretooth, and quote unquote Deadpool fighting on top of a nuclear power plant smokestack that gets that's why those fights have to end up getting so big, is because you don't give a shit about what's happening. Whereas in this one, I used to the joke I used to say about these movies was specifically the 20th Century Fox movies, so like Fantastic Four and the X-Men, is you could tell they were going to be bad and the budget was low when most of them take place in the forest. Yeah, because like X-Men 3, like, a good portion of that movie is just people standing around in the woods and it looks dumb. And Fantastic Four 2, there's a good portion of that movie that takes place with people standing around in the woods.
Right.
And this one doesn't have that problem, because what they're doing, you can have your final fight be just in a clearing of trees, because everything that's happening actually has weight to it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And let me see if you think that. I mean, to add weight to the end here, what if the Logan clone was a aged version of X-23, the girl Laura or whatever? I want, you'd probably have a hard time explaining it, but it would tie into the end where, as he's dying, he tells little Laura that she has to resist being the killer that they've made her to be. You know what I mean?
That would be interesting, actually. That would be, especially because of the way it ends, because she's the one that kills him.
Right, yeah.
And to have her actively kill her evil self, that would be interesting. I would be okay with that, I think.
Yeah.
I think that would be, I think that would still work. I mean, yeah, because I mean, you're still, that way you still have him dealing with,
it's still a part of him.
Yeah, he's still dealing with himself, but he's also still now dealing with the effect that he's had on other people. Yeah, I think that would have worked. That would have been pretty good, actually.
Yeah, I found myself a little bit distracted by the CGI young version of Jackman at some point. Like he was not. I didn't
think it was as bad as some other movies have done with that.
Yeah, I found it. It was so odd in this movie that it's like if it had taken place in Apocalypse or something, I would have been like, yeah, that's fine. That's part of the course. Yeah. But it's just how it stuck out in this movie is a little bit odd to me, and it's just it's
like
something to pay attention to.
Have you seen the new Blade Runner yet?
No, I haven't.
Well, you don't care about spoilers, right?
Nope.
Okay. Well, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen Blade Runner. 3, 2, 1. For as high tech and CGI filled. Well, they did do a lot of practical stuff, but you know what I mean. There's a lot of special effects in Blade Runner. One of the things they do is they do a CGI youthful version of a character from the first movie, which works. Like, it works in the movie and it makes sense given the subject matter. But it was weird to see them do that because it's like Blade Runner feels like such an older technology kind of movie. To see that new to see that new technology in it was a little bit off-putting at first.
Sure, yeah.
So it's weird.
Well, it reminds me of when we did the RoboCop stuff. We always talked about Verhoeven's aesthetic feels very clunky, compared to the technology that's going on. Blade Runner is kind of the same. It's a dirty future where clean tech kind of sticks out like that.
Yeah, same with this movie. It's a very dirty future, and it's actually, I like it because it's future light. So it's like, it's kind of now, but it's just future enough that there's some stuff that we don't have, like self-driving cars and that kind of thing.
Yep. You can take those leaps that you need to for the story without getting crazy with it.
Yeah. I actually thought the only time that effect looked kind of weird was that first shot where he's walking down the stairs, where they do it like in one camera pan where he walks by himself in one shot.
Yep, circles himself.
That was the only time I thought it looked kind of weird. Aside from that, I thought it was okay.
Yeah, yep. Huh. It's an interesting movie. Did you have anything else you wanted to bring up before we sort of wrap up this thing?
I don't think so. Yeah, no, that's about it. I think we covered pretty much everything.
Yeah,
Patrick Stewart's in this movie and he's good.
Yeah, he's the lead in it. And again, I think that the concept of the show is more just using a way to sort of find the highs and lows of a various career and sort of get a broad swath of movies that we're going to be covering.
I would like to say though, I hate to keep burying Star Trek Discovery, but it's been night and day for me doing these shows where we're actually watching stuff that's legitimately good.
Sure.
And not having to couch it and quantify why it's pretty good. So hopefully that can pick up and get back to, it's really satisfying to get to talk about stuff that's like legit worthy of talking about.
Yeah. And hopefully
with that in mind, keep listening to the Star Trek Discovery podcast where apparently I just shit on the show the entire time.
Well, I mean, and hopefully it'll tie into the very low ranked movies here where it's legitimately bad. A lot of these are going to be like pretty like, wow, this is a bad movie.
I'm afraid though that there are going to be a lot of these movies that are low rated that are going to be a slog to get through.
Yes, I think Christmas Eve might be that kind of a story, so we'll have to see.
Cool.
I mean, a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes is pretty special. There's a Wikipedia page dedicated to 0% movies on Rotten Tomatoes. And
is Christmas Eve a 0% movie?
It's a 0 and has 15 ratings at the last time I checked. So it's like a legitimate 0.
Wow.
So we'll get to that. But yeah, guys, thank you very much. Well, I guess we'll wrap up with Logan, just sort of final thoughts thing. I like Logan. I don't know if it's my favorite X-Men movie. Futures Past or First Class might take that spot for me, I think, but it's a nice break from the regular formula that they superhero movies kind of stick to. It was disturbingly violent. It had something to say, and it doesn't bludgeon you with the message or anything, and it leaves a lot up to imagination. It's basically a well-made movie, which is kind of nice to watch every once in a while.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I'd say it's the best X-Men movie because it's not really an X-Men movie.
Sure.
It's definitely the best Wolverine movie they've made. But that being said, I think they can do better. And what I mean by that is, so the last one they made, the Wolverine, was probably the closest they've come to doing a comic book Wolverine story.
That's the Japan one, right?
Yeah. I think there's a Wolverine movie out there where you can do a story that is, what's the word I'm looking for? Appropriate to the comic and the history of the character. Like, this is Wolverine, this is not the Old Man Logan story at all from the comic.
Mm-hmm.
That comic involves, like, the Hulk and a bunch of inbred Hulk sons and Hawkeye, and it's a really weird story.
Yeah.
So I think they can do a Wolverine story that is a classic Wolverine story and make a really great movie out of it. I think this movie shows that you can do that. I think they just have to work a little bit harder to figure out how this Wolverine can fit into comic book Wolverine.
Sure. I would need a different Wolverine storyline at this point. I've had enough of him being ruefully, dismissive of being part of a community, basically. Like, I need him to either just be on his own for a while and have his own vendetta thing and no larger team aspect or something, some different take on it. But that would be my only request if they do another movie.
I hope when they inevitably recast Wolverine and bring him back in some form, I hope they do him as a secondary character.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think he's, obviously he can. He is a character strong enough to build on the back of, because they've built every single X-Men movie on the back of him.
Let's just have very old Logan, and Patrick Stewart can play Wolverine in that future world.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, I think that. So yeah, you wouldn't rank this as your top X-Men movie, but you thought it was a pretty solid movie.
I would say it's. I guess I should quantify that by saying, like, as far as the quality of the quote unquote X-Men universe goes, I would say this is probably the most well-made movie.
Yeah.
I think as far as X-Men movies go, it's kind of hard to beat Days of Future Past. X-Men 2 is very close. I think earlier I said X-Men 2. X-Men 2 might still be the best. I don't know. I haven't watched it in a while. I don't know how it holds up.
Yeah, I don't know how it would hold up. X-Men 2 for a long time was my favorite superhero movie, like on pretty much all levels. I don't know if it's aged as well at this point.
I think, kind of like what I was saying before, I think as far as the X-Men as a visual concept translated from the comic to the screen, I think Days of Future Past is the most successful.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
and it's fun too. I was talking with Murphy about this after it came out, and his big criticism was he thought it was good, but it was just joyless. Which I can't really argue that it's not joyless, because it kind of is.
Yeah.
But I don't think they have to be like laugh riots.
I think they're the most their subject matter is the most appropriate to have a darker movie like that.
Yeah, I would agree.
It's not a Spider-Man movie and things like that, where if it was a joyless Spider-Man, you basically failed completely in what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
It's the extermination of a group of people and going back in time to save yourselves. Yeah, I think it has a little bit of an allowance there. I still think they have funny moments in those movies, character work and stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh, I meant he was talking about Logan as being joyless.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking of another movie. He thought Logan was joyless. Okay.
Yeah. Days of Future Past is fun. It's a fun movie.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. That makes more sense.
It has dark moments, but it is funny. But yeah, he was talking about Logan, saying Logan is joyless, which I can see. but I think it's appropriate.
Yes,
and I think not everything has to be sunshine and roses. So
yeah, I think my confused point would still stand for this movie. I think this one can get away with being joyless. I think it's a genre piece that's appropriate for that, I guess, in some way.
Yeah, I would agree.
Because if you're taking, I would say that noir and the Western are two very big influences here, and you can have totally joyless movies in both of those genres, and they make sense.
Definitely, yeah.
But yeah, that's about it. I think we're going to wrap it up here. It's the 93% Logan on Rotten Tomatoes, a movie that I very much enjoyed. It was a good time to watch. Patrick Stewart's in it, and he triggered off this whole discussion. And it's funny that the role of Patrick Stewart, the second tier man, is basically fit to a T in this movie. He is that role continuing on. It's not a outlier or anything like that. Let's see here. Well, guys, if you enjoyed this content and you want to hear more, you can go to the social media. All the links will be in the video description or the podcast blurb. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, all that stuff. You go to patreon.com/the Pensky File. You can support the show there. A couple dollars a month gets you extra stuff, and you'll actually be able to vote on what we talk about. So you'll choose the actor or directors that we discuss going forward. It'll be a director next month because we did an actor this one. I think we'll alternate back and forth. So write in some suggestions on the comments on YouTube, or just email us at thepenskyfilevideo@gmail.com. All that stuff is in the blurbs. Let me know what you'd want to talk about or see talked about as directors, all that stuff. Clay, you have anything you want to say before we sign off?
No, I don't think so. I know we have. I was talking to Dan yesterday about this concept, and he was very excited, and he's requesting to be featured on the Eddie Murphy episode.
What is? Hold on, let me look up what Eddie Murphy's high and low would be here. Does he know what do you think the high Rotten Tomatoes?
Rotten Tomatoes for Eddie Murphy. I'm gonna say high is Beverly Hills Cop, and low is Pluto Nash, possibly Norbit.
Oh, it's actually 48 Hours is the high. Is he a big role in 48 Hours?
Oh yeah. He's he's like the secondary lead in that.
Oh yes. Okay, so it would be 48 Hours for a high, and his low would be 1,000 Words, or The Adventures of Pluto Nash, probably. He stars in that one. Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Interesting. I'm surprised by which one did you guess for the top one? Where the hell is
Beverly Hills Cop.
Oh, that's at 84%. It's like sixth on his list.
Oh wow.
Yeah, 40. It goes 48 Hours and then Shrek.
Oh yeah, I guess that makes sense.
We have a couple rules about what we do. So there's no documentaries that we would do. They have to be sort of a top billed actor on it. And outside of that, that's it. Directors have to actually direct their movie.
I think unless it's like studio or director related, I think we should avoid animated movies.
Okay.
Because I don't think, like, let's say, if we were doing an Eddie Murphy high and low, and the high was Shrek, I don't think that's really indicative of his career.
Sure. I guess that's true. Yeah, the kids will know him as the donkey, and everyone else will just know him as Pluto Nash, I suppose, at some point.
I could see us doing like a DreamWorks high and low, which I think Shrek would probably be at the top of.
Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Like a best and worst of each studio or something like that would be kind of an interesting thing. But anyway, guys, I guess we'll sign it off there. We will see you next time when we talk about Christmas Eve, which is at 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. And that's about it. Guys, thank you very much. See you next time.